Well, hey everyone, welcome to our online service. We're so glad you're here today. If you happen to be new, let me introduce myself. My name's Greg. I'm the senior pastor here, and just honored to welcome you into our digital space today. If you are new with us, we would love to get to know you. If you're ready to be known, we're ready to know you. And the way we make that happen is we just invite you to go to our website. Right in the middle of our homepage is an I'm New button. Click that, you'll find an online connection card. And if you'll just kind of wave your hand that way and say, I'm here, we would love to reach out and get to know you and see if there's a way we could patch you into our local church here. So in a moment, we're going to hear a sermon by Jamie Lindtner. She is our children's ministry pastor at our Jennersville campus. She's got a great word to share with us today. But before that, we're going to hear a song, an old spiritual called I Want Jesus to Walk With Me. And isn't that at some level the heart cry of all of us? We just want to know that Jesus is with us and caring for us and guiding us. And you know He is. He Himself has promised, I will never leave you or forsake you. He said He was going to send the Holy Spirit to us who was going to be with us forever. But you know, it's one thing to believe that, and it's another to feel it. And don't we all just yearn to feel His presence? Well, that's what this song expresses, that heart cry. May it be your prayer today. Thanks so much for being here.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me all along my pilgrim journey, Lord. to walk with me.
Hello, and welcome to Willowdale Chapel's online service. I am so glad that you are joining in to watch this service today. If you are new or watching this for the first time or just new to seeing me here, my name is Jamie Lindtner. I'm the children's pastor over at our Jennersville campus. And I really am honored just to be able to be here and to have the opportunity to share with you from 1 Peter. So we have been working our way through 1 Peter the last couple of months. We are reflecting on this idea that we are a people of purpose in a world of chaos. In other words, despite the chaos and the brokenness that's going on all around us, we can still live with a clear purpose as believers. In our passage for this morning, Peter talks again about Christian suffering. And he points to the suffering that the church at that time was going through and that they were experiencing as a result of their following God. We're going to spend some time this morning reflecting on how, as Christians, we suffer. No one enjoys suffering. No one goes around wondering what they can do next to bring suffering into their life. Often it feels like we are just trying to get through it. We're just trying to survive as we suffer. But what if there's more to suffering than just surviving? What does it look like for us in Christ to suffer gloriously? What does it look like to suffer while trusting in the work that God is doing, both in us and in the world around us? We look around and we see suffering everywhere. We turn on the news right now and we are grieved as we look and read about and listen to the suffering that's going on in our world. Even right now in our own community, we see hard things going on in people's lives. We know suffering. There are trials that we watch other people go to, and there are trials that we go through ourselves. So before we read our passage and before we get into this teaching, I want to first acknowledge that this is a hard topic. It's hard to be in the midst of suffering and to hear what Scripture has to say about it. I don't presume to know what everybody who is listening is going through and what you're struggling with right now, or how you wrestle with your faith in the midst of those struggles. And I want to be sensitive to what is really hard in your life right now. But I also want to point you to Jesus. I want to invite you to allow space for him to work. And I want to encourage you to embrace Peter's words as encouragement and hope as we sit in the midst of our suffering. My grandmother, who is now 91 years old, birthed 8 children. She has since buried 3 of those children. 1 she buried as a child, and 2 were adults when they were buried. Her youngest child, my uncle, was killed in a car accident about 10 years ago, leaving behind a young wife, 2 young children. And I can remember having 2 very distinctly different conversations at his funeral. The first conversation was with one of my uncles, who was angry and frustrated, and he expressed that he could not believe in a God who would allow this sort of thing to happen. He was grieved over losing now his 3rd sibling, and he was heartbroken for his own mother, and he stood before me and he scoffed at God. Shortly after that, I sat down next to my grandmother and I asked her how she was doing. And I told her how sorry I was and how hard this is. And through tears in her eyes, she looked at me and she said, "Jamie, I could not get through this without my faith in God. God is with me and God is helping me." Perhaps there have been times in your life where you have sat at these very crossroads, choosing either not to believe in God or choosing to cling to God. Where are you right now? Peter points us to God. He encourages the church to continue steadfast in suffering because of who they are in Christ. We can either scoff at God and choose not to trust in him when we suffer, or we can remain steadfast with our eyes on the hope of what God has done and continues doing through Christ Jesus. Even in being angry with God, we can still choose him. Even in asking hard questions like why, or how could this happen, or what good is in this, we can still choose God as we wrestle with those questions. So my hope this morning is that we can boldly choose God, even as we wrestle with our suffering. Would you join me as we read together from our passage for this morning, which is found in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 19. Beloved, do not be surprised by the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing so. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Peter was writing to believers who knew about suffering. They were surrounded by persecution. They were surrounded by angry responses from their Greek and Roman neighbors who were persecuting Christians for their faith in Jesus. Peter, as a disciple of Christ, knew what it meant to suffer for his faith. And we know that as we look at the history of Israel, the history of the church, that darkness and brokenness and trials have always been a part of those who follow Christ. We can look at the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery, was obeying God, and still ended up in prison. He suffered both because of the sin around him and because of his choice to follow God. We can look at Moses as he led the Israelites, Daniel, whose faith in God meant being put in a den of lions, the apostles, who were arrested and beaten and in prison and suffered greatly while they spread the gospel message. We can look at modern day missionaries, and we can see that persecution is a theme that is woven tightly and boldly into the fabric of the Christian story. See, when we make a decision to follow Jesus, we enter into a battle. There is a cost for believers. A part of how we suffer comes as a result of how we live our lives for Christ. Our suffering, however, may be different than the suffering that Peter was addressing. I mean, we may not have our lives threatened because of our faith in God. We may not risk being arrested and put into prison simply because we come to church on a Sunday morning. But the reality is that it is becoming harder and harder to live as a follower of Christ in a world where Christians are hated and where Christianity is mocked. There has always been a separation between worldly living and godly living. But that separation seems to be getting bigger and bigger, making it more difficult and perhaps more uncomfortable to follow Christ. So we should expect to face trials as believers. We should expect that when we make decisions to be obedient to God, to the gospel, that the world may respond harshly to us. There is a cost with being a Christian. So we ask ourselves right now, How are we suffering for the gospel? How are we uncomfortable because we choose to do what is honoring to God? Do we speak the truth of the gospel even when it makes others angry, or it isn't politically correct, or it doesn't seem to appease what the world is offering? Are we the supervisors at our job who speak up for honesty instead of speaking for greed? Are we the boss who stands up for fairness to workers over profits? Do we suffer for Christ when we lose relationships within our family because we choose our relationship with God first? Are you the Christian student who refuses to participate in the party where alcohol is being passed around and friendships end because you chose to honor God with your decisions? And the students who are in your classroom or on your team or in your dorm mock you because of that decision? How do we embrace suffering as a Christian? When we choose Jesus over what the world offers, we choose the way of persecution. We choose the way of shame and of mockery and of misunderstanding. See, every day that we make a decision to either embrace the persecuted life for Jesus or to deny Jesus as Lord and Savior. And really, it's not hard to deny him. It's a lot harder to choose him. It's not hard to say, not today, Lord. I don't have time to spend with you. I don't have the extras to give. See, it's a sacrifice to make time and to set aside space and to give what we have first to God. It's so much easier to deny him. It is so much harder to stand up for Christ and to be obedient in our words and our actions. We can easily deny Jesus when we choose to gossip or we choose to lie. We easily say that he is not my Lord when our first priority is not to worship him, but instead it's the worship of sports or our job or politics. When we slander others, we participate in denying Jesus as Lord. When we settle for what's comfortable and for what's easy, and we rest in complacency, when we don't love our neighbor, or we make excuses as to why we cannot serve one another, or we prioritize so many other things over coming and worshiping our Savior on a Sunday morning, it is easy to deny him. It is so much harder to stand firm and to make sacrifices and to give up pleasures and to endure the hard, all while declaring that Jesus is Lord of our life. We may not think that we live the life of a persecuted Christian, but every day that we choose Jesus, every day that we make the sacrifice to separate ourselves from the world, we choose the suffering that comes with having Jesus Christ as our Savior. Our struggles, though, and our trials aren't just those that come as a result of persecution. The result of living in a sin-filled world means that we struggle daily with losses and hurts and diagnoses. And sometimes our suffering comes because we make poor choices. And sometimes it comes simply because we live in a broken world, a world that God did not plan for us. We live in a broken world where divorce happens and where children die. We struggle through addictions of our own or that of family members. We struggle to pay our bills and we face bankruptcy. We sit in the seat of despair as we fight for our health when the prognosis is grim. We face infertility and miscarriages that seek to break us because there is no good in any of these things. We suffer in silence with things like depression and loneliness, and we question whether or not God is really good, because how could he be when our hearts hurt so much? And really, the question in all of these scenarios is the same. Whether it is persecution because of your faith or it's the diagnosis of cancer, whatever the struggle is, the question is, Will I turn against Jesus to anger and bitterness and apathy? Or will I trust him? Will I deny him because of my hurt and my pain? Or will I rest in the hope of who God is? Because in the hour of our trial, of any trial, of all of our trials, the question always is, will I choose God first? So Peter encourages us, and he starts out this passage by reminding his readers to not be surprised by trials. He says in verse 12, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Peter's original audience knew of the persecution going on all around them. They weren't necessarily surprised at that suffering. But in the midst of trials and crisis, there is often the temptation to trust something or someone else instead of trusting God. For Peter's audience, it was possibly trusting in the kings of the people around them or the gods that those worshiped. So Peter advises them to be prepared for that. Prepare your hearts for choosing God in all things. Prepare for the suffering so that when it happens and when it comes, you're not tempted to choose other things. Anticipate suffering by putting your trust in God securely long before the suffering happens. Don't be surprised, because you are already immersing yourself in prayer, both individually and with prayer with other people. Anticipate suffering by reading your scriptures and by memorizing scripture and by studying God's word. Be ready by choosing Christ every day. But also, we should not be surprised to suffer shame or loss of status or grumbling or mockery because of our faith in Jesus. We should not be shocked when a crisis hits our family. We shouldn't look at our suffering as if it is out of place and doesn't belong there. It is right where it should be. We should anticipate suffering. We should expect pandemics and wars and the ongoing disagreements of people that we are closest to. Expect the suffering in real and personal ways. There is a cost in following Christ. There is a cost in living out our Christian faith. C.S. Lewis says, trials are not an elective in the Christian life. They are a required course. Don't be surprised. Don't be shocked. Don't think it's strange when you experience suffering. But instead, Peter tells us in verse 13, "But rejoice insofar as you share in Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed." Peter tells us to rejoice. And I don't know about you, but rejoicing is typically not my first response when I am suffering or undergoing any sort of trial. Rejoice. Because in suffering, we share in the sufferings of Christ. We rejoice because we know full well that in suffering, we identify more with Christ. We rejoice because in our suffering, we share in the sufferings of Christ Jesus, who suffered on our behalf. Suffering, any and all of it, and our response to that suffering is evidence of our union with Christ, and in that we rejoice. Our suffering is an opportunity to point to Jesus. It's a chance to bear witness to the cross and to the ultimate suffering servant who invites us to participate not just in the suffering, but also in the hope of eternal life. We rejoice in suffering because of the work that God did through Jesus in bringing us to full restoration. We rejoice because, as Peter reminds us, God is always working and God is being glorified, and our suffering and our trials and our brokenness points to that. Rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Verse 14 goes on and says, if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. When we suffer, we are blessed because of the Spirit of glory and of God is upon us and is with us. In Acts, we read of Stephen, who just before being stoned for his faith, we read that he was full of the Holy Spirit and he saw the glory of God. In the midst of his suffering and of his death and of his persecution, the glory of God was in front of him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego chose obedience to God, and they were thrown into a fiery furnace. And yet in their trial, God's glory was with them. As those surrounding them looked into the furnace, they saw a fourth figure standing with them. Friends, God is with you in your suffering. He is a part of our suffering. He is never absent. He is not surprised by it. And we are called to entrust our whole selves to the purpose of our Creator. See, in our suffering, we learn to no longer rely on ourselves, but to utterly rely on him who raises the dead and who heals the blind and who speaks truth and love to the sinners. Our suffering can be purposeful in bringing us face to face with the very one for whom we were created for. We come face to face with God as we struggle, as we enter into crisis, as we surrender our pain to choose him who has already chosen us. In our suffering, we can be brought closer to Jesus. And there is a testing of sorts that takes place. Just as Peter tells us, there's a testing of our faith, a testing of what or who has become our foundation. We can choose all kinds of things to help us in the midst of our suffering and our trials, but there is nothing else in all of creation as strong or as capable or as ready to help us through our suffering than our God. Suffering can strengthen our relationship with God. It can refine our faith. It purifies our spirit. And it weeds out all of the things in our life that pull us away from God, all of the things that beg for our trust but aren't trustworthy. There are moments in our suffering where there really is nothing left for us to do but to cling to God. And there is comfort in that. There is purpose. Our intimacy with God is deepened through our suffering. Francis Chan, who is an author and a pastor, he tells a story of a group of Korean pastors who were ministering in Afghanistan. They were then captured by the Taliban, and they were tortured, and some of them were even killed. Eventually, they were rescued. But after their rescue, one of those pastors said that they wished that they were still imprisoned with the Taliban. And they go on to say, when I was surrounded by these soldiers, I felt the presence of Jesus with me. Now that I'm back in Seoul, I'm trying to experience that intimacy with him, but I can't. I fast and I pray and I don't feel it. I would rather be back there because of the intimacy I had with him. Sometimes suffering strips away all of the things that keep us from a deep and intimate and beautiful relationship with Jesus. Fiery trials purify us, emptying us of the things that keep us from Jesus. I mean, can you believe that any of those pastors would rather be back in prison under the Taliban than being free? I don't think any of us can fathom that. But the desire for a closeness to Christ far outweighs the desire for comfort. Anything is worth going through if it brings us closer to Christ Jesus. Charles Spurgeon, a preacher in the 1800s, claims that the storms of suffering that he went through helped him to cling more closely to Christ. He said, when your house has been made to shake, it has caused you to see whether it was founded upon a rock. In our suffering and in our trials, in those moments of crisis, the Spirit of God will rest upon us. And we will learn to know God better, more intimately. We will worship him and we will trust him and we will talk to him and we will memorize scripture because the truth of the gospel is what carries us through our heartache. You might be a fan of America's Got Talent, or maybe you're familiar with this woman whose stage name was Nightbirde. The 30-year-old became famous when she sang a song called It's Okay. And she brought her judges to tears as she shared with him her story of cancer, going into remission, of the cancer coming back, of her husband walking out on her. She passed away just a couple of weeks ago from her illness, but she wrote words of hope and encouragement that she shared with many people while she was sick. Words of hope that for her was sustained by her faith in God. In interviews and in blog posts, she shared some of the following. She said, I believe that God can heal in one instant. I also believe that no good thing does he withhold. So there was something God was growing in the field that is me. And if God had pulled up all of this hardship too soon, it would have also pulled up these miracles he did in my spirit. So I remind myself that I am praying to the God who let the Israelites stay lost for decades. They begged to arrive in the promised land, but instead he let them wander, answering prayers they didn't pray. For 40 years, their shoes didn't wear out. Fire lit their path each night. Every morning he sent them mercy bread from heaven. I look hard for the answers for the prayers I didn't pray. See, when it comes to pain, God often isn't in the business of taking it away. Instead, he adds to it. He's more of a giver than a taker. He doesn't take away my darkness. He adds light. He doesn't spare me of thirst. He brings water. He doesn't cure my loneliness. He comes near. In her pain, Nightbirde had hope. Why? Because it's in our pain that God is nearest. Hope is often clearest to us when we have nothing left to cling to. Maybe that is what Peter was reminding the churches he was writing to. Maybe that's what he is reminding us of today. That God drew near to us on the cross. That God the Son took on flesh and entered into this sin-ravaged, cancer-stricken, heartbroken, suffering world to deliver us from it. Jesus, God who took on flesh, went willingly to the cross and experienced the suffering that our sin deserves in order to point us to the hope that is found in a relationship with our Creator. It's the hope of the gospel that allows us to not just endure, but to rejoice in the midst of our suffering. In our suffering, we know that there is more. Our suffering and our brokenness, our persecution, our graveside sorrows, our addictions, our poor choices, all of our choosing Jesus is not the end of our story. It's really just the beginning. The end is wholeness and glory and joy and worship in the presence of our Savior, where our suffering is no more. You may be familiar, and perhaps you have read the book series by C.S. Lewis called Chronicles of Narnia, about Lucy and her siblings, about Aslan, the great lion. C.S. Lewis tells a beautiful story of 4 siblings who end up in a place called Narnia and the battles that they face to protect Narnia from evil. In the last book that he wrote of that series, rightly entitled The Last Battle, C.S. Lewis opens up the story by saying, "There was a real railway accident," says Aslan softly. "Your father and your mother and all of you, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead." But that's not the end of the book. That was the beginning of the book. The end of the story, the very end of the book, C.S. Lewis concludes it like this. He says, "Aslan said, the term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and so beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all of the stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has ever read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before it. Friends, our suffering is not the end of the story. This world is not what we were created for. As Peter reminds us, we are exiles. We don't belong here. And I don't know if that makes our suffering easier, but it helps us endure. And it gives us purpose in our suffering. And it reminds us that we do not suffer alone, that God is with us. He is always with us. And one day we will sit in glory beside the one who is glory. And friends, the only reason that we can rest in that hope was because of the way that God allowed his very own son, the flesh of his flesh, to suffer on a cross for our sins. We have a high priest who has gone before us and has shown us how to suffer. He shows us how to suffer as he suffered in our place. God knows our grief. Pastor and author Louis Giglio says it this way for us. He says, just because it's hard doesn't mean God's not in it. Just because it hurts doesn't mean he can't use it. Just because you feel alone doesn't mean he's not working. Just because no one on earth applauds it doesn't mean heaven is not cheering you on. Just because others are against you does not mean God's not for you. God is for you. Not just for you, but he loves you so deeply. And he does use our suffering, and he uses our trials to help draw us closer to him so that we can learn to rejoice in all things, because all that we do as believers ought to be done in order to bring glory to our Lord, whether it is celebrating or it is suffering. And so in the midst of the fiery trials of your life, I invite you this morning to rejoice in Christ in order to allow the Spirit of God to rest on you as you trust in God and the work that he is doing in you and through Christ Jesus. Amen.
Well, thanks so much for being a part of our service today. Of course, we welcome you to watch us online whenever you want. But we'd also love to see you in person if you're inclined to visit our church. More and more people are gathering these days, and we meet every Sunday at 9 and 10:30. We'd love to have you come out. In fact, if you go to our website and click I'm New, you can actually plan your visit. Like, we'll have welcome people here ready to receive you, and we'll just show you around, show you the ropes. We want to do anything we can to help this church feel like your church. So come out and see us sometime. But now, let me send you with a benediction into this new week. And this is from Isaiah 43:2 that says this: when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you go through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you go through the fire, it shall not consume you, because the Lord your God is with you. And may you sense his presence walking with you this week. God be with you as you go.